Hey Dan,
Hey, man, how's it going?
I'm doing good. Ready for this. Let's wait for a little more people to come up and let's see if Astral is already somewhere around here.
I can see some awesome people in here already. Hi, Harley, Steven. I'm just going down the list here. There's so many people on UFO Twitter that you have glancing interactions with people, and then you see them pop up again, and it's just so nice to see everyone paying attention to the conversation, the
Yeah,
UFO conversation, I mean.
yeah. There are a lot of because I wanted to have someone with this level of knowledge and everything that's been going on since 2017. And man, I honestly I didn't think that uh, Peter would say yes. And I had already canceled, actually. I told Astral, and like 2 hours later, Peter responded to my messages, and I was like, what the hell? This is happening. Okay.
That's awesome. It's going to be a great conversation. And yeah, when I came in just now, I just heard you giving props to James Falk. Am I saying his surname
Yeah.
right there? For his awesome interview with Levenda that's just gone out. I'm seeing some clips flying around. That's on my list to watch after this one.
Yeah. And I like that James likes to explore the more parapsychology aspect of the phenomenon. And I think
Yeah,
those conversations are quite unique just because of that, It's not just UFOs, it's like the whole spectrum.
yeah, man, 100%. You know, when you're kind of in this for a while and you've read a few books, watched a few documentaries, talked to some experiences and other people that have different ideas about the phenomena, you realize that this isn't just about flying things in the sky. This almost addresses every single aspect of what it is that our species is doing on this planet and touches every single aspect of just what we think, what we dream, you know, all the way down to our imagination, down to the occult, spiritualism, biology, chemistry, physics. You can just reel off the whole list. Everything is impacted by this. So it's important, I think, to have someone like Peter and especially James who are willing to address these things head on and get out of that box that we always find ourselves in.
Are you going to ask him about Crowley, dude? Because I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm going to leave that to you though, because I'm less versed in the book per se, because I did start reading it, but I don't like to throw an opinion before I finish my books. I can talk about my questions are like more broad, but you can ask the questions about the book that you found most interesting. I'm not gonna touch on those that much.
Yeah, man, for sure. It was actually funny because I'm about 35% through the book. It's a long one, but it's incredible. And just as I was writing, because you asked me to do this with you very kindly, thank you. And just as I was writing kind of things that I wanted to talk about with Peter that I thought he might find interesting, I wrote a bunch of Crowley and Parsons stuff, and then literally the next chapter that I got to, the next segment of the next chapter, was all about Crowley and Parsons. So I was like, oh, great, cool. Peter's going to be into this line of conversation.
Yeah, I want to hear a lot about that because we can tie it to the stuff I sent you about Grinberg because Levenda is a scholar of Grinberg's work. And I found that very surprising because everybody I've asked about Grinberg since I got here, uh, at least the people who are more in the know of this, they've all told me that they don't know who he is. And I find that really strange. And when I asked Peter, he was like, yeah, I know his work. I read his work. I'm like, okay, this is going to get interesting.
Yeah, man, and I did the same, right? Like I've never come across that guy before, and I thank you for sending me the papers over, and I'm really curious for you guys to essentially whet my appetite and whet the appetite of everyone in the space who hasn't heard of that stuff, because the stuff you sent me was astoundingly cool and interesting.
I think Astral is already here.
Well, it's by Tom there from Estimate of the Situation. If anyone here doesn't know what Tom does with Estimate of the Situation, His work is incredible. Some of the best in the community, I would say. Um, Him and his creative team go back into the archives and drag out all of the kind of correspondence and reports and things like that, and they make graphic novels based on that factual information. So not only is it stupidly entertaining and beautifully drawn, it's also accurate. And I've given the graphic novel to a few friends who aren't kind of interested in the UFO stuff, but they really dug the graphic novel, and they came back with a whole bunch of questions asking, where they can find out more and stuff. They didn't realize that it quite goes that deep, and it's such a cool way to present that information. So yeah, if you don't know Tom and his team estimate the situation, I highly recommend go have a look at their work and grab the graphic novel, because goddamn, it's amazing.
Yeah, I had Tom on Psicoactivo, and we had a really cool conversation. I'm hoping we can get them either here or his partner soon for a round two. That'd be cool.
Yeah, man. I've seen that they're playing with some live action is that I guess that's the wrong word, but proper filmmaking kind of stuff based on the same ideas that the graphic novels are. So again, just really cool on ramps for the phenomena, and I would say something that probably To the Stars wanted to do initially and just didn't get to enough of. So yeah, I think people would dig that.
Astral is here. I just invited you, Astral, as a
Sup,
co-host.
Astral?
All right. Now just waiting for Peter. The gang is here.
Yo, what's up?
Hey, man.
Hey, what's up, Dan?
How you doing today?
Chilling. Just came from my son's baseball game, so just hanging out now. Now I can chill the rest of the day.
Oh, wicked.
How's UFO Twitter week been so far? How would you rate it?
That's amazing, man. I think every week for when there's a concentrated group of spaces around the topic and great discussions, great hosts, I think more of a concerted effort to bring the discussion to a place where, it's positive, it's contributing, it's more about the ideas and less about the people involved. Well, it could definitely be about the people, and it highlights the researchers and speakers. I think it's like an elevated week where, all the drama and the bullshit's not involved, not really part of it. And so I think it's been great. I mean, we've had Chris Bledsoe, Matthew Pines, Michael Masters, just Darren Exo Academian. So it's just a lot of people that I've looked forward to listening to and speaking with some. So it's just been a great week.
Nice. I like to hear that, man. I hope we can close it out with style. I know there were some spaces that were canceled for today later, right? Patrick canceled his, right?
Yeah, every day there's usually some switches around and shifts, and I think that's the thing about the week is it's very flexible. So some people, I saw Vetted canceled his space, and unfortunate.
That is, man. Patrick does good work.
Yep. One of the new voices, right? In the community.
It's so nice to see new voices come in. Like way back, there were just 10 of us just throwing UFO conversation to each other on Twitter, and now there are so many people here, and it's so cool to see more voices come into this space and share like their puzzle pieces, I guess, and their unique perspectives on the phenomena. And as you'll probably hear Peter say in this conversation, this phenomenon needs us all to figure it out.
We were talking about marketing too yesterday during the researcher space, in that I think a lot of people who are old school researchers or have been in the ufology for a while, they might not be the best at marketing. And so a lot of their work might get overshadowed, or just because they've got their head down, they're like, they're in the weeds, they're doing the work. They're not like poking up to be like, oh, I wonder how my Twitter page is doing, so
Yeah.
I think that, it's a platform like Spaces and, a concerted effort to get the researchers and the people that have been doing the work to, directly in contact with the community so that they can like talk with them, I think is really cool. And so it's one of the motivations behind this.
Yeah, man, 100%. I totally hear where you're coming from and couldn't agree more. For what 900 years now, we've gone through so many different mediums and so many different ways of communicating, and some people give up, right? Like I love technology, but I wonder at what point in my life I'll just kind of go, TikTok, Snapchat, and just, so many different options that I'll just give up. But you're right, it needs new people and younger people to come in to show folk how to get their ideas and their research out there.
I think also we need to consider how the field is still evolving in many ways. And I think the fact that more people with credentials are coming into this space to share what they know, I think it's going to help the field become more professional in many ways. And it's not going to come without trouble, as everything, but any change can cause trouble. But I think it's important, and we're going through an important phase in all of this.
I was very impressed with Matthew Pines, bro. I was like, holy shit, this dude, this dude needs to be one of the ambassadors, because I asked him about Arrow. He broke down Arrow better than anybody I've ever heard talk about it.
Yeah, he throws in some really interesting points.
But I think people coming from, like, he's a little bit of the crypto analyst, social scientist type of thing, where they're looking at some of the bigger pictures and maybe have been involved behind the scenes too with the networking that needs to happen with some of these fields and other areas.
Okay, so we got Mr. Peter Levenda here now. Just so you guys know, I am not going to accept invitations for at least the first hour, so we can throw our questions, Dan, Astral, and me, to Mr. Peter. And then when we're done with the questions, we're going to start asking more people to come up as speakers so they can ask a question. Is that okay? All right.
Awesome.
I invited Peter as a speaker. Yay! Mr. Levenda, it's a pleasure to have you here, sir. People, Mr. Peter Levenda is the co-author of the Secret Machines non-fiction books. But he's written I counted 25 books. I think there's more, right? Welcome, Mr. Levenda.
25, I think, is pretty good. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
We have Dan Zetterstrom from That UFO podcast as a co-host, and the Astral from the Need to Know team and the UFO Twitter Spaces creator. Welcome, guys, and thank you for accepting my invitation to co-host.
Thanks, bro.
All right.
Thank you, man.
So we're going to start. I was telling them, Mr. Peter Levenda, that I am going to ask you broader questions that do have something to do with the most recent book. But since it's been not that much since it was published, I don't think everybody has read it yet. I know Dan has a lot of deep cut questions from what he's read so far. But the questions that I'm going to ask you, I decided, because I've seen you throw this analogy around of addressing the elephant in the room, and both in written form and spoken form. So I decided to tell you about some of the elephants that at least I want to be addressed, and I think that someone with your level of knowledge could answer them. So I'm going to start with the first question, then we go to Dan and then Astral. We take that order, one each. Is that okay?
Sounds good.
All right, let's start. So I guess the first elephant that I want to address is ancient scripture and the repeated history of gods, and how these gods that seem to be kind of the same ones are related to what the phenomenon is. What can you tell us about all of these different cultures that seem to have the same gods? How do you think they're linked to the phenomenon?
Sure. I think we kind of laid that out in the first book of the Sacred Machines trilogy. The very first opening statement is framing this entire conversation in terms of a cargo cult. And this is what actually got the attention of the people we were trying to find to talk to in the government and in industry and in the intelligence military community. We came up with this concept as our sort of mission statement, and we said, okay, is it possible that our religions and our sciences both are the result of a kind of cargo cult? And for those who don't know, there was such and there still exists a cargo cult in the South Pacific, and this sort of happened in the early to middle 20th century, when Stone Age people, indigenous people in what is now Indonesia and in that region, saw planes for the first time. They saw aircraft landing, and they were cargo planes, and all kinds of stuff was coming out of the cargo planes. It was military weapons, it was food, it was medical supplies, it was clothing, all sorts of things. And these Stone Age people looked at this and thought, this is great. Somehow these things come down from the sky and they have all these goodies, So they started to build airstrips in the jungle, and they started to imitate what they thought were the towers, and building everything out of basically bamboo or whatever they had at hand, in this idea that by duplicating what they saw, those planes would land on their airstrips and give them stuff as well. And we said, based on this concept, is it possible that our religion and our science were sort of jump-started by some kind of contact similar to what these Stone Age indigenous tribes had in viewing, just around the time of World War II, all these aircraft landing and all sorts of stuff going on. And that got everyone's sort of attention. It's like we were headed in the right place. And that began to open doors for us. People started to take what we were doing seriously back in 2015. So the short answer to your question is yes, there's a similarity, and I think there's a similarity for a reason. Number one reason that the anthropologists will tell you is, well, we're basically all humans, we're basically people, and we're dealing with some of the same factors. We're dealing with the need for food, for shelter, all of to protect us from, wild animals, that sort of thing. So there is a basic commonality between cultures. But then it gets really specific, right? It gets to the point where there's beings coming down from the heavens, and they're giving us knowledge, or they're giving us stuff. And that's a cargo cult scenario. And so we started to say, what if, religion in general, remember, there was no such concept as religion until comparatively recently. Whatever culture you were born in, their belief system was your religion, but they didn't call it religion. It was just how things were. It was their view of reality. Even ancient Egypt, as a good example, there was no concept of religion, like we have this religion. This was their culture. This was it. This was reality. The gods were real. The environment was real. Everything was interrelated. It was all part of one piece. It's only lately we started cutting off religion and making it a separate box in our experience of reality. But I think until comparatively recently, everybody kind of agreed on some basic things. And that is that the gods lived in the heavens, that there was such a thing as immortality, that you could go to the heavens, but perhaps not in this bodily form, perhaps in some other form. All of these things we can trace back to ancient Sumer, to ancient Egypt, obviously, to ancient China, to ancient Mexico. I mean, you have very common belief systems everywhere that basically talk about the same thing. How they get there is different based on their culture, based on linguistics, based on their environment, how they get there. But the basic concept of we need to get off the planet, we can get off the planet, there is such a thing as immortality, there are gods in space, all of these things seem to be shared.
And potentially true. Who knows? We have destroyed so many scriptures over the decades and centuries that who knows what else was there, right?
But the evidence is still there. I mean, I remember Harry Reid, the senator who actually started this whole AWSAP ATIP program. Somebody asked him once about the reality of the UFO phenomenon, and he said, the documents are already there. The information is already there. You're just not looking at it the right way. And I think the same thing is true religion. We may have lost a lot of scriptures. I know we have, right? But the scriptures that remain and the texts that remain, the techniques that are still there, are still telling us the same story. The information is there if we know how to look at it.
All right. And between the scriptures, because I don't know if you're familiar with Mauro Biglino, who does translations for the Vatican. He was excommunicated also.
Oh, I heard about this. Yes.
Yeah. I think he has the most accurate translation of what these beings are. I mean, I can't help but compare his work to Zachariah Sitchin, but Sitchin took a different interpretation. And I would say that Biglino probably has the most accurate to date. I guess that's where it all originates from, right? The whole story.
Possibly, yes. I think, though, that if we focus too much on the differences of interpretation of translation, there's key things that we could pick up with a very good translation, but in general, the story is still the same. So one very good translation of one technology, of one technique, and I refer to these as spiritual technologies. One translation of it, may be better than another, but taken as a whole, if we look at the world culture and the world systems, we can still find a great deal of commonality that will still lead us in the right direction. We may miss a piece here or there that the ancients had that we don't have, but I think in general the system is still there. And all it requires is that we actually, put our foot on that path in order to find out, which of these works better, which of these is more quote unquote correct for our approach, for our culture, for the way we look at the world. But it's all still there. It's been mapped out.
Thank you, Peter. Now it's Dan's turn for a question.
Hey, Peter. It's lovely to finally speak to you. Love your work. I won't go too into that praise and waste my time, but just thank you.
I appreciate it.
You might kind of know me by, I'm the guy that did the Tom Was Right design that kind of got out there.
Right.
And I wanted to kind of talk to you about this notion that ideas and art could be somewhat of a solution to, or find us some solutions for the phenomena. In war, you speak a lot about how people like Parsons and Crowley, who I'll get into in some of my other questions, or almost fed off lots of sci-fi authors that they read and kind of built these communities of sci-fi authors who almost guided them on their process towards things like the Babylon working and things like that. And I was also hoping that you could touch on, for people that are in here that aren't necessarily familiar with these occult things like Crowley and Parsons and Thallimer and things like that, if you could just touch a little on that and explain why the woo really isn't that woo and out there, and kind of would provide us this big puzzle piece going forward for studying this.
Fair enough. You got two basic questions that you asked me there. The first was about the arts and the second was about the woo stuff. And basically it's all the same answer. For instance, we started talking about the gods and the ancient scriptures. If you look at, just take Egypt as an example, because it's probably the most famous one. Art and religion and the state and science and all of that was all one thing, right? So it wasn't like we have the artists over here doing their thing, and then we have the priests over there doing their thing. The priests, the art, the temples, the statues, the hieroglyphics, everything was part of a continuum of consciousness, a continuum of belief. And I'm using the word belief even as it's not really a particularly good word. They were basing their entire life on this interface between every different aspect of reality as being all part of one experience, one reality. And that's why I say in all the Secret Machines books, and I've said it on interviews and everything else, this is why we need the artists, the writers, the musicians, the painters, and the soft sciences and the psychologists, the philosophers. Everybody has to be involved in this approach to understanding what the phenomenon is, because it started that way with everybody on board. All of these groups had everybody on board. They were all part of the same search, the same attempt to figure out what actually happened and how to get back to that state. So we tend to break all these down into separate boxes, and that's a big problem for approaching the UFO phenomenon. It's not just a nuts and bolts thing. It's not just a consciousness thing. It's something that transcends all of those boundaries, which are kind of artificial. So when we're talking about the woo stuff, it looks woo because we framed it that way for the last couple of 100 years. We've set up this boundary. The scientific revolutions of the last few years have estranged themselves from the religious philosophical aspect of it as much as possible. And they've tried to put religion in a box saying, well, you can't prove it. It's not falsifiable. Therefore, it has nothing to do with what we're doing. This is what we're doing is science. And what you guys are doing is woo, right? Now we're getting to the point where we got to bring that woo back in, because that's how we're going to understand the phenomenon. People are having experiences with the phenomenon that are woo. We have the guys, on the Nimitz, they're having one kind of an experience. They're flying jets and they're seeing these things flying around with them and kind of screwing with them and doing all kinds of weird stuff. But the experience that they get, right, when the pilots come back down and they're talking to people, is a woo experience, right? They can't believe what they saw. What they saw is impossible. What they saw defies physics. Everybody's has reporting something that cannot possibly exist. So we're back to woo. And who are the experts at woo? Were the people involved in religion, but most specifically the people involved in the technology of religion, which brings us back to what we popularly consider to be occultism or magic. All of that actually has a basis to it. There's a process. There is a lot of basic things that people agree upon, even across cultures. For instance, I always like to use the example of the Dalai Lama at Dharamsala had invited a bunch of Jewish rabbis to come to Dharamsala to discuss various things with him. Paramount among them, how do you survive in diaspora? Because obviously he lost his country of Tibet. The Tibetans are now scattered around the world. How do you maintain, for thousands of years, a culture that long? But as he's having that conversation, you have a bunch of the Kabbalists basically talking with the Tibetan monks and comparing notes, right? Comparing notes on the process, on the spiritual processes that they both understand. And that is where we need to be. We need to look at these experiences as something valuable that's going to teach us how to cope with this new reality we're on the verge of experiencing big time. Things are happening at a really rapid pace. They don't seem that way to ufologists who've been around for a while. They think it's dragging. But believe me, as somebody who's been around for that long, this is going very fast. This is going faster than we can expect. It's like turning an oil tanker around in the middle of the ocean. It takes a little while, but it's turning. These things are happening. And if we only rely on the nuts and bolts and we don't focus on things that Crowley used to do and Parsons and not just those guys, not just the Thelemic operations, but, the Golden Dawn before them, or the Merkava mystics of the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries that were trying to descend to the chariot. They were trying to ascend to the 7 levels of heaven. St. Paul mentions different levels of heaven in the New Testament. There's all of this material is there. We're just not looking at it the right way. And if we have to take the blinders off and stop looking at this stuff like it's weird, satanic, diabolic, or just insane, and look at it and ask ourselves, what is really happening here? What is really going on psychologically? What is the implication for consciousness of the UFO on the one hand and all this occult mystical stuff on the other? Are we not talking about essentially the same experience?
All right.
What a wonderful answer. Thank you, Peter. I'll pass over to Astral for the next question.
Yeah, go Astral.
Yeah, that's great. I've also thought about the missing link sort of could be parapsychology and what you were just describing in the history of that research that people sort of overlook when they get into the topic. I wanted to ask you though about the non-human intelligence and maybe the intention behind it. One of the points of contention within the community is the benevolent discussion. But I wonder, in your opinion, what are the best pieces of evidence or ways to determine whether a non-human intelligence would be benevolent or malevolent or neutral?
Yeah. those terms are projections, right? They're very human projections onto this phenomenon. Benevolent and malevolent implies intent. And this is the problem that I have with the terms. Are they benevolent? Do they intend us well? Or are they malevolent? Do they intend us evil, right? I don't think there's anything like that. I think we're trying to cast in human terms what this phenomenon does, or how it behaves. I said before that I don't believe that they've ever fired a shot at us in anger. They haven't actually shot at us. There's been no, death rays and stuff like this, like we have in science fiction movies or War of the Worlds or Independence Day. But they can be just as dangerous without having done that. I think the question we have to ask is, are they dangerous? Are they dangerous in the way, my walking on the street is dangerous to an ant, walking on the same street? I have no malevolent intentions toward the ant, or benevolent. I have no intentions at all. And I may actually damage the ant, kill the ant without even realizing it. So does the phenomenon share that same relationship to us? It doesn't seem to be, because they're trying to interact, right? They are deliberately interacting with us, and they're still not killing us. They're still not damaging us, but they are interacting with us. So that doesn't mean they're benevolent, but it doesn't mean they're malevolent either. I think we're going too far on that. I think the only basis we have for trying to understand their intentions, if such a thing as intention exists in their culture, is to talk to the contactees, the people who claim that they have been contacted, and look for commonalities, look for common experiences, common expressions, kind of the way John Mack did with his patients, that he said we're all suffering from PTSD from these experiences. And there seem to be some commonalities. One is communication. They communicate, but primarily it seems through pictures. That kind of makes sense. That's basically how you would communicate with someone if you just landed in their country and you were in the midst of a jungle perhaps, and then they came out and there was no common language. You would point to things, or you'd point to yourself, or you'd try to make communication based upon images, because the sounds would make no sense. So that seems to be an indication that there is something there that's trying to communicate, if we trust the contactees, and then compare what the contactees tell us to those experiences that our military have had, and the militaries of different countries in the world have had, in basic kind of communication, which also seems to be in terms of pictures, right? They'll fly around us. They'll make strange patterns in the sky. They may turn off our missile bases and turn them back on again. They will do things like that, which seems to be communication. And our responsibility is to follow that up and see what that communication means, see if we can take that to another step. And in another interview, and in Secret Machines War, I talk about a Russian general who decides, let's try to talk to them, right? Let's make let's make gestures with our hands and arms in the air and see if they follow it, see if they're mimicking us, and they actually did. So this idea of mimicking our physical movements sounds very Close Encounters of the Third Kind, right? But why did that movie make that much sense, right? At the end, why were they using music? Because they couldn't use words. They were using images. And the famous motions, I can't do it, we're not visible here, but the famous motion that they were using with the hand motions, right? And then the alien would duplicate the hand motion. This was actually something the Russians were doing during the time of the Soviet Union. So that was taking place, that was happening. And that is sort of the extent of it so far. I don't think that we can jump to any conclusions about benevolent or malevolent yet. I don't think that we can get there, because we don't know what we're dealing with. We don't know if we're dealing with robots. We don't know if we're dealing with cyborgs. We don't know if we're dealing with an organic life form. We don't know what we're dealing with. So we can't really ascribe these moral or ethical colorations to the communications that we're having yet. All we can do is take this step by step, as if we're talking to an infant, or as if the infant is trying to communicate to us, because we're at that level of communication yet with the phenomenon.
You made me remember one of my favorite authors from Latin America, Eduardo Galeano. And his book about football, he talks about what it would be like for like an alien civilization to come to Earth and see a full stadium filled with people and wonder what the hell are these apes doing, all put together in a massive place. And it goes to show that we don't really know if they know how to communicate the same way we do. We don't even know if they have a sense of humor like we do. That would be really nice to know. But you reminded me of that.
Well, also, as I pointed out in the books and in interviews, we've never heard nobody's ever said that they actually have that they can sing, that there's any music on their end, right? I mean, everything seems to be very cut and dried when there's contactee experiences. Do they dance, right? Would they understand the concept? So yes, a sense of humor is very important. And a sense of humor implies so many different levels of meaning in a communication, right? Where it can be taken the wrong way, or it can make people laugh or make people uncomfortable. We don't have that yet. We're nowhere near that level of contact. And we don't know if that's even possible, which is why I've also critiqued this idea that there was an agreement, between, for instance, the U.S. government and the aliens back in the Majestic 12, days, that there was some kind of between Truman and Eisenhower and the aliens, some kind of pact. How would that even be possible, right? There's no common language. There's no common culture. And how would we enforce any contract, or how would they enforce it, right? So that to me doesn't make any sense at all, right? So if we don't have that commonality, and NASA, funded a whole project trying to get all these linguists and archaeologists and anthropologists together to say, how would we communicate with an alien culture? And they all pretty much came back and said, well, you can't. They grew up on a different planet, supposedly. We don't know what their DNA is like, if they have DNA. We don't know if they're carbon-based. We don't know so many things. All of these things would impact language. Even just temperature, water, oxygen in the air, all of these things will impact how a language on their planet would develop, plus other conditions, war on their planet, or other things would happen. So there's no way for us to have a common language. It's just not possible from our perspective anyway. But the contactees say they do communicate. They communicate in pictures. And that's, I think, the one thing that that NASA's specialists kind of didn't really catch. And that is that a picture may be the beginning of a means of communication. But you're right. If they were to land, and especially, if they're watching a football match in England where everybody starts killing each other at the end, they will really be confused. And they'll wonder, like, what is going on there? Why is this happening this way? Why do they all voluntarily sit there, watch this, and then get angry and start, beating each other up? So that's got to be completely confusing to any alien being. It's still confusing to me, to tell you the truth.
Okay, so I wanted to just ask my question because I think that this is going to be kind of a long and varied conversation, so I might as well ask it just now. I told you about Dr. Jacobo Greenberg. You told me you have read his material, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because I'm following a case with him that he disappeared and all that, but I just want to ask someone who has actually read his work. Do you think there's something to what he was working on? Do you think it was possible for him to make telepathy mainstream as he attempted? Because I keep asking a lot of people who are like on your level of knowing, and most of them don't even know who Grinberg was. And I wonder if maybe I'm just looking at something different.
No, I was fascinated with Grinberg for a number of reasons. One, his work on shamanism. I've written about shamanism in other books, and I started really researching it because of Mircea Eliada's book on shamanism, which I found was very, very impressive. I know there's a lot of problems with it. People have critiqued it. But shamanism to me seemed like a way into this very problem we're talking about, because a shaman, especially the Siberian shamans, they undergo this process of initiation, which seemed to me like deliberately entertaining a kind of complete nervous breakdown, right? And they would do it alone. They would do it in the forest. They would experience a kind of death. Their body would be cut open. Their organs would be removed and then cleaned and then the organs reinserted, they would be sewn back up again. They'd had this horrible experience, right? An experience of death, dismemberment, and then pulling it all together. And then something happens to them. They come back to their community, and they're healers, they're shamans. So what fascinated me was the idea that what Grinberg was doing was saying, let me look at the shaman experience. Let me isolate it as much as I can. Try to understand what it means for our understanding of reality. Does reality exist outside, or is it just a construct of our minds, of consciousness? You know, we're building a kind of fake world based upon a bunch of disparate senses, but different information, data that's coming into us, and we're constructing this world. And then we deal with other people, and we agree on the basic construct of this world. And if that's true, then the brain is much more capable than we understand that it is. And it's really just a kind of interface between consciousness, which may be outside of ourselves, and an interior understanding of consciousness, sort of like the matrix concept, right? So I was fascinated by that. I was fascinated by his point of view of shamanism and his work with shamans. And the idea of taking the shamans in Mexico, I think he was working near Cuernavaca, right in the south of Mexico City, in one case. And, you know, the idea of getting into that mindset, because the shamans seem to be telepathic. They seem to have a connection to information sources that we, as a rule, do not have. And yes, so to answer your question, and I'm long-winded about it, I know, but the idea that telepathy is accessible to anyone, that people can be taught it, I believe is true. I believe that that's an absolute. Telepathy is only one of the many cities, for instance, that you're taught about if you're studying yoga in India, and you're trying to progress along a certain path, that you will begin to obtain certain powers, but you're not supposed to go after them. You're not supposed to deliberately drop everything and seek them. They just come along naturally, and you just kind of ignore that and keep going. That's the advice that they're giving you. But here, we deliberately tried these things. We deliberately tried to understand telepathy. We had, the famous Stargate operations. We had remote viewing. We had MK Ultra, let's face it, that tried to do all kinds of strange stuff, try to get into what they call the black box of consciousness, rummage around in there and see what could be done. Let's use hypnosis. Let's use drugs. Let's see if we can create new personalities. Let's see if we can erase an existing personality and replace it with a different one, as they were trying to do in Canada, with Ewan Cameron, the famous psychiatrist there. So all of these things were deliberately being attempted anyway. We know this. We know the Russians were doing it. We know the Chinese were doing it, still are doing it, right? So, and those are the countries that we know about. We can be fairly certain most countries in the world have some kind of project like that on the books. So to answer your question, yes, I think he was on the right track. I think his experimentations were fascinating. I don't know why he disappeared. That's mysterious. Was it deliberate or was it, involuntary? That's the other question you have to ask. But, I read his books in translation, but I can read Spanish. So I read the Creation of Experience and his whole text.
That's a brilliant book, that one.
Yes, it is. That's the one you have to, and it's, so far I don't think it's in English, but it's fascinating. I mean, the experimentation that he went through, the Faraday cage experiments and all the rest of it is fascinating. But that's what we were trying to do here with Andrija Puharich and the Nine. He was trying to develop systems that would do the same thing. He was testing psychics to see what was the physics behind their experience.
That's the thing, Peter, because in my investigation, Grinberg met with Puharich, Vallée, Keel, in different conferences in the 80s. And I don't know if you're familiar with any of that or if you have any information on that, because I found that very interesting that they were like collaborating in a conference that was started in the late 1800s and it went on for decades. Like every few years they would get together and talk about all of these different phenomena. Did you know about this?
I don't have any background. I know what's been posted, but I don't have any, deep background on it. So I don't consider myself an expert on that. So.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Now, Dan?
Wow, you guys just blew my mind with that. I've got like 3 more books I need to read now. Thank you. It's really interesting, Peter, that you talk about the shamanism kind of having access to information that we just generally don't think that they would, and we would see that as kind of a form of telepathy, especially when we're talking about pictures and how we're developing as humans and making movies and very visual kind of forms of communication, and the increase in kind of how we ram those pictures down people's throats, you know, going from 2-hour movies yonks ago to now TikTok. People can't watch something for more than 20 seconds, you know?
Yeah.
And yeah, it strikes me as funny, like it's also all kind of tied together, you know, art is intuition and remote viewing is intuition, and all these things kind of plug into that space. And the end of Close Encounters really taps into that, I think, when both sides are kind of using that intuition, and it's not just artists, there are mathematicians using it at the end of that movie as well, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of just jump back and kind of think about something more positive in terms of this stuff. You said earlier, you know, things moving fast with this, and it really is. And there's this kind of one pinch point that people in the community often talk about, where everything kind of exploded outwards, literally and figuratively, and that's the atomic bomb. And it kind of signified a moment in time where David Lynch used this word in Twin Peaks called garmonbosia, which was kind of a food for the beings, right? But it also kind of encompasses this fear, sorrow, and hopelessness that we've lived in ever since. You know, if it's not the atomic bomb, it's the Cold War. If it's not the Cold War, it's wars in the Middle East that are kind of happening. And even Lovecraft plugged into this and kind of, you could almost see Cthulhu as his example of the atomic bomb. And really, it's the ultimate hubris and taking heaven by storm. And, you know, it's very Promethean in nature. And what I wanted you to talk about was this lovely phrase that you had that kind of melted all that away for me in the book, where you brought up this idea of mutually assured protection, which is the opposite of mutually assured destruction. So humanity kind of seems lost in this fear, sorrow, and hopelessness. And if there is something that feeds on fear, it's eaten pretty well these days. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about how humanity can kind of get back on the right track and find some hope in all of this.
Wow, that's a tall order. What do I have? How do I get it? How do we get humanity back on track? Well, I think in the first case, the idea of garmonbosia and fear, and Lynch, of course, I'm a big Lynch fan. He seemed to really address some of these issues in a kind of dark way, but very perceptively. I think that we are feeding on it. It's not just whatever is out there feeding on the fear. We're doing the same thing. I mean, Charles Manson famously used to tell his followers, get the fear, right? If you can get the fear, if you can wallow in it, essentially, then it won't be a problem for you anymore. I think the same thing we saw in Apocalypse Now, you know, the horror, you know, you have to make fear your friend, as the Marlon Brando character was saying, Colonel Kurtz. You know, once you got that, then you could win the war. But they were using fear against us, and that's why we're losing. So, and I think even just recently, I saw a video of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who said that, you know, fear is a profound experience, the most profound experience of our lives. That just came up recently. I think the Centro Gabo had put that film out. So it's just this, and of course Lovecraft, you know, talks about it constantly. So we're talking about fear, and I'm wondering if our avoidance of fear is what's causing the problem. I think anybody will tell you that if you want to, you know, succeed in certain things in life, you have to kind of go through the fear that you have, whether it's fear of meeting people, fear of public speaking, fear of whatever it is, the fear is holding you back. Is it possible that we have to look at this fear and address it and figure out why it is that we're afraid? What is it we're really afraid of? And address that fear. And then I think the rest of it solves itself. I know that's kind of a Pollyanna-ish thing to say, but I think there's truth in it. I think the fear is the obstacle. It's not what the fear represents, it's the fear itself. It's that feeling of, I cannot face this thing. I cannot, I don't want to. Anybody who studies, virtually anything to any great extent, if you're studying medicine, you're going to come across fear pretty quickly. If you're studying psychiatry or psychology, you're going to come across fear very quickly, yours and other people's, and trying to deal with it. Fear is this thing that's always there. And quite often the fear has no basis in reality, as you find out when you do the thing you're most afraid of and suddenly realize it wasn't such a big deal after all. So I think that this is the problem that we have. We are now so used to being frightened to death by everything, and we're being told to be frightened. We're being instructed in paranoia constantly. And let's face it, the UFO community is not immune from this, right? So there's a lot of paranoia in the UFO community. We're being lied to, we're being manipulated. This is happening, that's happening, the other thing is happening. We can't trust this one, we can't trust the other one. We don't take anything on at face value anymore. We don't test hypotheses anymore. We look first to who is giving us this hypothesis. If we don't like them, then we fear them, and we fear what they're telling us, and we ignore them. And that's not a very scientific attitude to take, but still it's what exists. There's a lot of fear and paranoia in this field. And I basically don't feel that way myself. I'm not looking at the phenomenon from the sense of fear. I'm looking at it with care. I'm being tender towards it. I'm not going to run, willy-nilly into an embrace of the alien as our friend or as angelic beings sent here to guide us, because so far they haven't done much where that's concerned. I could have a few, bones to pick with them over that. So, by the same token, they're not trashing us either. So our fear is not well placed yet. We don't have anything yet to fear except, as Roosevelt said, fear itself. And that's what we're afraid of. We should be afraid of fear itself. We have to get past it. And I think that we should be at the forefront of this, because the UFO community is everybody. It's scientific people. Lately, especially, we've gotten a lot of scientists on board. It's artistic people. It's artists and writers. It's people from every walk of life. We're all here in this together. We should not be this afraid of everybody else. We should be saying to ourselves, okay, let me listen to these other people and see what they have to say. Let's pay attention to the contactees, for instance. And let's pay attention to the military. Let's understand where they're coming from. We don't have to embrace their point of view, but let's understand why they behave the way they do. They do because we've told them to. We've told them to defend the country, right? And now they have this thing sitting in front of them, this elephant in the room. And what do we do with this thing? How do we defend ourselves against this? So of course they're frightened. Of course they're afraid. And maybe they need more input from the rest of us to kind of tone that down, dial it down a little bit, and try to look at the UFO from a different perspective. But, that means getting past the fear. And I think that's what we have to do. I think we can do it. I think this community, above all others, is open to all these suggestions. Everything from the real woo on the one hand to the nuts and bolts on the other. I think we can find common ground and be an example for the rest of the communities that are trying to grapple with this.
That's so well answered. Thank you, Peter. It's almost like, with the Nine, it was an invisible force that essentially inspired whole groups of people to go and change the world in their ways. And we're still doing that, but we don't realize that we're doing that in our pursuit to define the rational. We're becoming irrational in a way. And I think when we think of Crowley and Parsons, we almost do the same thing. It's always, the Beast and 666 and things like that.
Right. When
you really get into their work, it feels like self-help stuff before Freud, to me at least.
For sure.
And it's almost kind of, I listened to a really cool podcast called Weird Studies a few days back, where they thought of meditation as inner spelunking. And I was like, that's just the perfect metaphor, diving into the darkness, into the unknown, and facing it head on. Sure, the abyss talks back, but that's what we're here to do, right? That's what we're all here to do, is to try and define this darkness. Cool. Thank you, Peter. I'm going to pass to Astral for the next question now.
Yeah, just bouncing off of that, I was going to ask my question on sort of the scientific stigma, and you mentioned other sciences and researchers getting involved from other fields, but I think the stigma is still there, and a gap of they might be on the fence looking for some more definitive or better framed research that's being done. And I wonder, what do you see as the challenge, or maybe when you're talking to these folks, academics, people who you are seeing on a higher level research approach, what gets them really interested in the UAP topic? What gets them to take it serious? And maybe what do you also think on the flip side maybe pushes them away from the topic to be like, nah, no, thank you.
Yeah, well, I think that it depends who you're talking to. When I was talking to people who were involved with for Skunk Works, for instance, right? So there was one engineer in particular, and he just told me, I just want to know how they work. I want to know how they fly. He says, that's the thing, because they're there and they're doing this stuff and it doesn't make sense. And I need to find out how. And that's all this guy was focused on, was trying to develop basically a saucer. Can we do this? What is the technology involved? Is it always a round shape? Sometimes are they cigar shaped or the triangles? I mean, does the shape affect the aeronautics? Because it does for us. Why doesn't it seem to affect it for them? So they were following this line of taking it. The important thing is taking it as a reality, right? They accepted that the UFO exists. They accept that this thing happens in the sky and has these weird aeronautical maneuvers. And they went from the basis of, yes, this is real, to, well, how do we make that happen? How can we do this? How can we duplicate it? And hoping that by trying to duplicate it, we'll actually uncover the secret of what it is. So was one approach. The military approach is, my God, yes, they're out there. There's something going on, and it's screwing with our military. It's screwing with our missile bases, with our nuclear installations. It's obviously a threat. And the people that I spoke with from DOD would say, our fear is that this is the advance guard of some major invasion force. To which I would say, but they've been here for thousands of years. They could have invaded us a lot easier back then, right? When we had, bows and arrows. Now we've got nuclear weapons. Why do they wait so long? So it's this idea that they had this feeling that this is the beginning of something bigger, that it might be, a wholesale kind of appearance. So they're worried about that. So they're taking it seriously whether they tell it to the public or not. Generally speaking, they're still, they still feel fear about it. They're still concerned about this. So now we have, on top of that, we have the other people who are involved in it in politics. And their approach to it is, in some cases, it's really, really weird. They think this is spiritual. They think from a very Christian, fundamentalist point of view, these are not beings. These are not, other types of human type creatures or anything like that. These are angels and demons. That's what we're dealing with here. And we're not supposed to look at that. And like that engineer told, I think, John Alexander, that one time he wrote about it in his book, you're not supposed to know this stuff until you die, right? And that was an engineer talking. So we're surrounded by all of this. We're surrounded by all of these things, and everybody's put off by something different, Not everybody's put off by the religious aspect of it. Not everybody's put off by the military aspect, but everybody has something that they're worried about that makes them hesitant, to go further. Of course, there's the public ridicule. There are some news outlets that are very sort of aggressively talking about the UFO phenomenon and talking about it as if it's real and trying to give everybody a space to talk about it. And there's other news outlets that will be resistant to it because they think it's part of the anti-science crowd, right? And if it's anti-science, then, why should we give it any airspace at all? So there's these two political points of view on it, and that's a problem, right? So if you're a member of one kind of political ideology, you're going to not look at the UFO phenomenon because it's anti-science. And if you're another, well, we're going to look at it because we don't trust the government at all. Therefore, there must be something to the UFO. Nobody's approaching the UFO on its own grounds. And that's the problem. No one's looking at the UFO phenomenon on its own and saying, what is it? They're filtering it through ideological or political considerations. They're filtering it through economic ones. If I start studying the UFO, am I going to lose tenure? Am I going to lose my grants? Or is the money going to dry up? If they're public figures, are people going to start laughing at me? Will I lose my audience share? So there's all of this stuff going on until somebody comes out and says definitively, this is a real thing that we have to look at. People are still hesitant, and people have come out and said that. Our government has come out and said that, in not in so many words, but they have. They've released video footage. They've talked about it. Government officials have talked about it, but not enough yet. There has to be a groundswell. There has to be a lot of people saying, we need to know. And to protect whistleblowers, especially, that's got to get through Congress. There's got to be a way to protect whistleblowers on the subject, because there are a number of them out there, and they would be happy to talk if they could be protected, if they don't go to jail for it, for violating a security oath or violating their NDAs. So, there's that aspect as well.
All right. Thank you, Peter. I want to address another elephant in the room that when I saw Commander Fravor, he was the first one that I saw his account of what happened, and I was like, okay, so there's something to this, right? But it was really curious to me that everybody in the military, even Lou, kept saying, even you guys say on your books, that it's impossible for this to be tech from humans. And I guess that's what I call the science breakthrough elephant in the room. Because there's a lot of information, maybe it's false information potentially, but there's a lot of information that there may have been like some sort of breakthrough in anti-gravity in the early 50s. And I know that Jesse Michaels, for example, from American Alchemy, is like dead set on investigating that part of all of this. I wanted to ask, based on many stories of either scientists who disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances, are you certain, like for sure, that we haven't had a breakthrough since,
Oh, nobody can be certain, because we don't have access, right, to a whole classified world out there that we don't have access to. This cuts across not just politics, but also the military and intelligence and science. I mean, it's at the crux of all of this. Anti-gravity, of course, people have studied it. There's no question that people have tried to find an anti-gravity solution. The question is, the phenomenon has been around a lot longer than our scientists have. So it's not like this technology is our invention, right? Let's say we developed an anti-gravity device. Maybe we have one under wraps. Maybe we have a whole fleet of them under wraps. We wouldn't expose it to our quote-unquote enemies, right? We wouldn't want Russia to know about it, or China, to name the two big ones, or any other country for that matter, to know we had a fleet of anti-gravity, vehicles. And if we did, would we fly them over other countries? The reason I'm saying this is I go back to Project Sign, right? The very first UFO project in the United States. And I write about that in the books. It fascinates me because of the people that were involved with it and the reaction that they had. When Roswell happened, the Project Sign people, after they were trying to understand it, and they said, well, would it really make sense if somebody had this technology, that they would risk it by just flying it over the United States for no particular reason, and then risk it crashing somewhere? If this was really a technology that a human country had, that we had, or some other country had, would they risk it in this flagrant manner, just, flying it around for no particular reason? If Russia had it, they would keep it in Russia. They would fly it in a very small part of Russia, at least until we had U-2 and satellite technology. They would fly it around there, like locally, and then bury it, right? And keep that in reserve for when, they thought they were going to be invaded by someone. But no one's used this technology yet. No one has. So we have to then assume, okay, if there's anti-gravity technology, who's got it? Do the Russians have it? Do we have it? Do the Chinese have it? Is it a Nazi program somewhere in Argentina that's developed it? We have to ask all these questions and follow that through and see if it makes sense. And if it makes sense that it's something that was developed recently and not from ancient times when there were UFO flights doing exactly the same things that our UFOs are blamed for doing now. So if there's anti-gravity, it must have pre-existed our attempts at discovering it, which means that those vehicles that we see don't have to be ours, right? Because they've been doing this for centuries. So maybe we have anti-gravity technology, but would it be the Tic Tacs, right? I hesitate to come out and say categorically no, that it's not our technology, but I just don't see enough evidence to suggest that it is, because of all the rest of it that goes around it. I mean, this would be earth-shattering technology, right? And So we're only using it to tease our own fighters on both coasts, and to zap our missile bases and stuff, and to play games. I mean, really, that's what we're doing? Or is it really what we think it is, something that's not man-made?
I ask you because I've seen some sort of a sea change recently with Matthew Pines and Chris Mellon, who kind of allude to potentially China already having some sort of technology. And even Chris Mellon said that flat out. He was like, some of them we should shoot them down. I found that really interesting. Why the sudden change,
Well, Chris Mellon has thought for a long time. When I first met him, his major fear was that this was the UFO phenomenon was a kind of an advance guard, for a bigger invasion of some kind. So he's a DOD guy. So, he goes back to the Defense Department for decades. So this guy is plugged into that mindset. And I credit him. He knows more about the interior of all this. He knows where all that stuff has been going on much more than I ever will. So I have to listen to him and pay attention. But by the same token, China is a possibility, if only because they had some brilliant scientists working for them, that started in this country, working for Theodore von Kallman, a guy who was a friend of Jack Parsons, to go back to that story. So here was a Dr. Tien, and here was a guy who was Chinese. He actually was brought to Nazi Germany by Theodore von Kallman as the war was winding down. The war had not been over yet. Von Kallman, a very famous scientist, won the very first National Science Medal awarded ever by John F. Kennedy. And this guy is in Nazi Germany with Dr. Tien, and they are interrogating Nazi prisoners of war, Nazi scientists, trying to figure out what they were up to. And this was like kind of a dangerous assignment. Tien and von Kallman go back to the United States, and they tell General Hap Arnold, who they were working for, saying, what you have to do is create a military industrial complex like the Nazis had, because they had a total war operation, and they had all the assets and that they needed, all the technology they needed, all the money, all the resources. We have to do the same thing because, Russia. So, this was really the beginning of it. And you would think that Tien would be above reproach, but then there was the McCarthy era, right? We're bringing Nazis into the United States like crazy for Operation Paperclip, and we're arresting the people or firing the people that helped us develop the atomic bomb, like Oppenheimer. And instead of replacing these guys with Nazis. And Dr. Tien was one of those who lost his security clearance just because he was Chinese. And so Tien finally said, okay, screw this, I'm out of here. I'm going to go to China, which in those days was Mao, was still in charge, and it was the early days of the revolution. And we're telling him, no, you can't go. And he's saying, well, I'm going to go anyway because you guys have screwed with me. You think I'm a communist. You think I'm this, I'm a spy. He says, forget this. I can't work like this, and I'm out of here. So he's the guy that goes to China, jumpstarts their missile program, jumpstarts their aerospace program, develops the Silkworm missile, right? And at the same time, the reason I'm coming around to this is that Tien is training people in things like Chinese martial arts, Chinese medicine, all of these things that are traditional in China. He was focusing on that and focusing on exactly what we were discussing about before, developing telepathic abilities, developing ESP abilities, using a combination of Chinese medicine and what science that he knew already as a physicist and as an engineer. So you've got, you have the basis for it right there. You've got a very revered scientist who died a few years ago. He was a major hero in China. But he had started in this country, and if we hadn't been so stupid, he would have stayed in this country. But instead he went to China, did all of these things for China. And yet CIA was keeping a close watch on him because of all of his publications were not just about science. They were about Qigong. They were about Tai Chi. They were about all kinds of Chinese, martial arts, medical stuff, and all the rest of it, with a focus on the paranormal, on developing the paranormal. And this was the guy who hung out with Jack Parsons, right, at what will become the Jet Propulsion Lab, in Pasadena. And Parsons, of course, was involved in ceremonial magic, Aleister Crowley, and the whole 9 yards as well. I mean, you start digging into the space program, you're going to find the mystics. They're right there. You dig into the UFO program, you're going to find the mystics. They're all over the place with this. So anti-gravity may be an extension of something much deeper and that we don't really appreciate yet, but something that they would want to keep to themselves. They would not want to go and flaunt it by flying around our ships. I just don't see it that way. Although, I have to listen to Mellon, and, he has his reasons for believing this could be a hostile threat and that it could be coming from China. It's a possibility. I have to accept it as a possibility, but do I believe it in my soul of souls? I don't yet. I don't see the proof. I see that we've all been doing this. I think that we've all been trying to find the key to the black box, the key that unites science and mysticism. That particular key was focused on by Parsons. It was focused on by Dr. Tien, and by a lot of other people since then. So I think we have to sit back and think, has there been a scientific accomplishment that would blow us all out of the water if we knew about it?
Thank you, Peter. Dan?
Hey, yeah, wow, what an answer again. I could talk to you for hours, Peter, honestly. Touched on it a little bit earlier, but I wanted to talk about really getting uncomfortable with solutions to the phenomena, and the danger and the short-sighted nature of kind of anthropomorphizing the phenomena itself. When you look at the evidence and the testimony, ET is almost way too conservative for the evidence that we have and for the experiences people have had. And the ideas of things like Fae fit even better. But the truth is that whatever it is going to be nature. And so we need to kind of almost step back and think about how we define life all over again. All of the different kind of parts of science have a different idea of what life is. For some parts of science, the way they explain life, water fits the bill, for example. But for other parts, we don't even seem to fit the bill. And then when you look at things like viruses and the way that scientists talk about being at war with viruses, COVID is a really good example of this, the constant cat and mouse game of the virus adapting, just seemingly like something responding like it has some kind of awareness. And I always kind of thought about that, like, the virus is a microform of life and it sees our medium of the macroform of life as a different medium entirely. And putting ourselves in those kind of perspectives, I think, is maybe going to bring us some kind of richness in coming up with a solution. And the virus thing even fits that whole, that which is above is the same as that which is below, where it's a fractal nature of things. And to touch on sci-fi authors and things like that, again, I recently listened to Philip K. Dick's Valis. And Valis, if people haven't read it, is a vast active living intelligence system that is proposed as kind of the overmind of the universe, or the insane overmind of the universe, I should say, and even plugs into the idea of time not being parallel, time is parallel, not linear. And some of the work that To the Stars have even done, there was a game where you had to, find this mysterious woman called Vivian, and the golden egg of the end of that game was that there may be purely informational or digital life forms out there. And there's a really compelling tweet that you put out, or should I say post, not too long ago, where you spoke about if we all had a shared dream and then we woke up, does that constitute some form of contact from something more abstract? And this kind of constant guessing game that we're on makes me feel like we're almost being educated. And, our hearts and minds are kind of being won over in a way as we kind of walk this path together. And then, as well as talking about, uncomfortable solutions there, in war, you mentioned if we learn too much too fast, does the teacher reveal itself almost? I wanted you to touch on that as well, if you wouldn't mind.
Wow. Okay. Where do I begin? Okay. Well, one thing that jumped out at me as you were talking, the problem that we have in understanding this phenomenon, and it may not be what we think it is, we're focused too much on the phenomenon itself, on the its pyrotechnics, let's say, on its weird, the way it appears to contactees, the way it appears in the sky to Commander Fravor, for instance. What is behind it? You know, we don't ask the question of what is behind it. This is just the face of it. This is an externalization of something. And we're not looking deep enough behind what it could be. And we're too dazzled by the displays. We're too dazzled by these things. We're not always asking the right questions. But yes, we have to, the idea of getting deeper into it, of not mistaking the symptom for the cause, yes, is important, and defining life is important. We talked about that a bit in Secret Machines Man, for instance. The idea that, you know, we have already gone to the place where we're developing machines that move and talk and act on their own. We're at this point. We're at a tipping point. We're at this famous convergence, you know, that Kurt Kurzweil talks about, you know. So we're at this point where we're going to flip over to the point where we won't be able to tell what's real and what isn't, what's human and what isn't, what's organic and what isn't. We're doing this ourselves. We're approaching the point where we're becoming the alien. We're becoming the ET. We're actually creating what could be mistaken as aliens or ETs because we've got the technology down that far. If we combine artificial intelligence with virtual reality and with robotics and with all of that, and we're trying to do it, we're on the verge of doing it, we're going to be creating an entire reality which is alien to our own, but which is still the product of our own. And we're going to build in all kinds of problems into this newly created reality because we haven't solved our own problems yet. And what we're going to do is we're going to port those problems into these systems that we're building. And are we going to get to the point where we won't be able to tell the ET from the human? We're approaching that point. The aircraft, if we've developed anti-gravity, for instance, to go back to that previous question, if we have it, then we can't tell. We won't be able to tell our technology from theirs. We won't know what to shoot down if it comes to that. If Chris Mellon's, you know, idea comes to that stage, we won't know which side to shoot because there'll be anti-gravity stuff flying around like crazy, which can possibly change shape the way the ETs have been able to do. And so, you know, now what? Now we're a victim of our own inventions. You know, now we've built a prison for ourselves to live in. So this is, I think, the problem that we have. Your point about viruses is well taken. Viruses are, you know, living creatures. And Scientific American back in the 1970s, I believe, which when I was doing work on this in a different way, was talking about genetics. And they had some excellent articles on the DNA code. And they were saying that actually there's only two potentially immortal species on the planet. One was the DNA code itself, which replicates itself endlessly, just needs a host, and it can duplicate itself anywhere, in any medium. I mean, all plants, all animals, all humans, they're all a version of a DNA molecule. And so they're essentially immortal. But the other one is the cancer cell. The cancer cell is also potentially immortal. As long as the host is alive, it will continue to keep growing. It will multiply like crazy. It only dies when the host dies. So that made me think about, you know, wars between light and darkness and angels and demons and all the rest of it. Here you have two potentially immortal beings fighting for control of the same host, right? So that led me down a certain bunch of rabbit holes I don't need to go into right now. But the idea was considering these things as living beings, as life. And if it has life, does it have consciousness? And that's the other part of your question. Because is consciousness out there or is it in here? Right? Mm-hmm. And so David Chalmers, for instance, would say, you know, the consciousness is an emergent property of the brain. And I don't think so. I think the brain's an emergent property of consciousness. I think consciousness is there first. And I think that is what is motivating the virus you're talking about, as well as the DNA molecule, as well as the cancer cell. I think it's a consciousness construct that we're looking at. We're looking at consciousness manifesting in different ways, for different purposes, different sizes, shapes, and all the rest of it. And that goes back basically to Grinberg that we were talking about with Pavel. So it goes back to all of that. It starts wrapping this together. But I mean, it seems like it's wrapping it together if you're following this conversation at all, which you may not be, and I don't blame you. It's a little out there, but yeah. Okay. Let me stop right there. I'm getting too carried away on this as it is.
No, I love it. You know, nature as something, or evolution itself as something that builds toward utilizing consciousness is a really interesting idea for me. And thinking about our reality as alien realities, you know, if you go back 200 to hell, even 50 years, like our modern day is something alien to someone from that time. And I don't think we really grok that. And you're spot on when you kind of say it really gets to that question of what does it even mean to be human? We almost need to turn the mirror on ourselves to understand what we're encountering, right?
Absolutely. I agree.
All right. Astral had to drop out for a little bit, but I'm going to ask the next question. Okay. So I wanted to ask you, like, in general, because there's a lot of people I've talked to on my channel, and most of them tell me that we're dealing with multiple phenomena. So out of all the different hypotheses, the crypto-terrestrial, future humans, ET, interdimensional, which ones do you think are the most likely to be the case?
Let me see if I understand that question. Are we dealing with different phenomena? Let's get back to that. Are we dealing with different phenomena?
Yes.
Is this all one phenomenon? Well, I always go back to the airship mystery of the turn of the century. So here we had basically UFOs, but they were not flying saucers. They were ships. They were like wooden sailing ships, but they were floating in the sky, right? And they were floating, and they would sometimes stop, and they would continue on, and they went from the West Coast all the way they crossed the Atlantic and all into Europe, and in order, right? I mean, it's step by step by step. They didn't like spin around. They didn't go to here or there. They just went in one straight line, and people reported it. You know, every week there was another report, and it was further east and further east and further east. So this thing, whatever it was, or these things were flying around. They didn't look like what we think of as, you know, the Tic Tacs or flying saucers or the Horton lenticular craft or anything like that. They were sailing ships, for crying out loud, that had anchors, right? But they're in the sky. So is it the same phenomenon? I'm thinking it's the same phenomenon in different clothing. We're projecting a kind of into this phenomenon a little bit the way Grinberg discusses it. And we're kind of projecting this field onto something out there, and we're making it fit something that we have in our head, but that it's one phenomenon that looks differently depending upon where it shows up and to whom, and when it shows up and to whom. And I think it might all just be one phenomenon manifesting in different ways. I'll give you an example from, you know, since we've talked about the woo stuff, let's go back to the grimoires of the Middle Ages of Europe, right? And there was this idea that when you evoked a demonic spirit to visible appearance, you had to command it to look nice, right? Not to be scary, not to be intimidating, but to appear in a fair and beautiful fashion, so that, you know, I wouldn't be disgusted by it if I did that. And you can read that in the Greater Key of Solomon, I think the Lesser Key. You can read that in a lot of grimoires, where it's important to force this being that's appearing to you to assume a shape that you can relate to. And it's there in manuscripts written hundreds of years before the airship mystery took place. So I'm wondering, is that what we're talking about with here? One phenomenon, just wearing different clothes, depending upon our consciousness, depending upon the screen in our head, and how we're organizing this experience to make it palatable so that we can somehow relate to it.
Okay.
I was just going to say, I adore the airship stuff and reading those kind of encounters from people who describe the beings as coming down the anchor chain as if they were swimming in water. And it just sets off so many ideas about how they see our medium, even if it's even something outside us. You know, you mentioned DNA earlier as a life form. I think that's really interesting.
Okay. I do want to ask you, I'm going to ask you one more question that, because in my channel I do cover very different topics. And I want to ask you about one specific topic that I'm trying to cover in the most objective manner, but I know it triggers a lot of people. So I wanted to ask you about what's happening in Peru with the Nazca desiccated beings. What is your opinion on that?
Okay, cool. I was afraid you'd ask me that. I knew it was coming. Yeah, the Nazca mummies. I just don't know. I mean, initially, the first reports we got, it was cranial deformities. It was this, it was that. I know that Gary Nolan, had studied it as well and came away with the idea that he wished they were something extraterrestrial, but from his point of view, they weren't. And then there's been so much since then that's been going on. I've been trying to follow it. I've been trying to listen to the people talking about it. I just don't know what to say. And I think that's as best as I can give you. So I'm not saying that it's not. I'm not saying it is. I'm thinking, I'm listening to arguments and I'm saying, well, there might be something there. Let's wait until, let's wait till this has progressed a little bit further along until we can know for sure. It seems like the kind of medium that would be good for preserving something like this. I've been to Chile, as probably many people know. I know the Atacama is like this really arid place. It's filled with minerals as well. It might have been an attractive location if there was a sort of an ET civilization or ET visiting. Seems like it would have been a logical place among many others on the planet, but still. And if an ET being was organic and it had died, it would have been preserved pretty much that way. Just the way the, mummies were preserved in Egypt and all of that. So I think there's a possibility that we're looking at something human, but there's also a possibility that it's not. And, all the votes aren't in yet, I think. So I'm going to hold off on coming down with a presumption one way or the other on that. I really like to accumulate as much evidence as possible, as you can tell from my books, which are extraordinarily long for that reason. And I just try to, I tried not to jump to conclusions. I find it fascinating and I kind of hope that it's true. So I'll leave it there, I guess.
And just Dan, if you want to ask one more question from you, and then we're going to go to questions from people who want to come up and ask Peter something. Is that okay?
All right. Of course. First of all, Peter, props for saying, I don't know. I think that's such an important 3 words to be able to say in this subject, in this community. And there are no easy answers here. So we should get comfortable with I don't know and being in that kind of unknown space. So my final question, I'm going to keep it simple for you. I know the rest of mine have been heavy for you, Peter, but thank you for being patient and giving me such great answers. But I was just going to ask, people have so many different interpretations of the word disclosure. When people say, has disclosure happened? Depending on who you ask, it could mean so many different things that it's almost impossible and a question to even begin to answer. So I was going to ask you what it means for you, what disclosure would mean for you, and in your opinion, has that line been met yet? And also then, just before we go to audience questions, if you could just please plug your event with Marco Visconti that you've got coming up that just sounds incredible, that would be great.
Fair enough. Disclosure. I ran into a problem with this concept of disclosure, because people do interpret it different ways. And, Chris Mellon, since we talked about Chris Mellon famously said after the New York Times December 2017 article had come out, and then these videos were making their way through, and we were still getting this enormous pushback from the UFO community. The To the Stars people were getting this pushback. And Chris said, when are they going to take yes for an answer? And that was his reaction. He was like, are you kidding? The government just came out. I mean, we're releasing this. We're saying this exists, and people are saying, no, it's the government telling us. So I was at the very last Contact in the Desert that I did, which was years ago, just after all of this was happening. This was, I guess, 2018, because the December stuff had just come out in 2017. This was June of 2018, I guess. And, I was doing a panel discussion, or I guess it was, or something. And there's this big audience out there. And the hostility against To the Stars was incredible, right? There was one guy wearing a To the Stars t-shirt, and I said, "Are you crazy? Do you want to get shot?" This is Contact in the Desert. They don't like, this. So I was there and I was doing this panel discussion, and I said, there's all these people out there, the largest crowd, I guess. And I said, guys, you can throw away your tinfoil hats. It's over, right? It's in the New York Times, right? It's in the New York freaking Times. They're reporting this on CNN. The days of, hiding under your bed, with your X-Files poster, it's over. Okay. You can get out. You can talk about this now. And they're looking at me like I had three heads. And I'm saying, don't you understand? It's as now. And then what happened? Other people on the panels were saying, well, we don't trust the New York Times. I'm thinking, oh my God, you don't trust the New York Times now that it's publishing this absolute affirmation, and you don't like it. Well, I don't care. I don't like the New York Times. I won't mention the panelist who was saying that, but he's well known. He's been around, and it was part of this conspiratorial thing, right? And it was like, well, we don't trust the government. And I asked them, I said, well, where do you want disclosure to come from, if not the government? Who do you trust disclosure to come from? Is it going to be like a rock star? Well, we got one. We got Tom DeLonge. What, you don't like that? Okay, who else do we have? So, I mean, it's like, where's it going to come from, if not the government? And you had, then Lou Elizondo's coming out and talking, well, we don't trust Lou Elizondo. He was an intelligence guy. Well, hello. Do you want the janitor in the Pentagon, the guy who empties the wastebaskets? Do you want disclosure from him? Who do you want it from? So, I had that, I went around and around in circles on this disclosure thing. A disclosure is, different things to different people, obviously. It depends who's giving you the disclosure. That's what I discovered. If Chris Mellon comes out and says, we're disclosing, it's not good enough. And he was like an undersecretary of defense, right? If Lou Elizondo comes out and says it's real, well, we don't believe him either. If senators and congressmen are out there talking about this in the real world, well, we don't trust them either. We didn't vote for this guy, so we don't trust him. And it's like, well, where do you go? Who do you want disclosure to come from? And if you're talking about, do you want to see a dead alien, or you want to see, a flying saucer in front of you, and I know, you're going to say it's AI. You're going to say it's a deep fake. I mean, you're never going to accept it, right? So disclosure is going to happen when the alien comes knocking on your door, right? And says, here I am. And if you're waiting for that, well, it may happen, right? But don't say we didn't tell you. Don't say we didn't warn you. Disclosure has happened. It's there. It's now, it's more like confirmation than disclosure perhaps, but it's still there. It's happening. It's ongoing as we speak. I don't know if that's any good, but that's my 2 cents. That's my 2 cents.
Perfect. And just, if you could just plug your event with Marco Visconti, that tell people what that's about and where they can get tickets, that kind of thing, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, I have to talk about this or Marco will kill me. And he has ways of doing that. Yes, this is a thing that we've developed in tandem. We started this as a kind of an online thing last year. I wrote a book called Stairway to Heaven, which was my master's thesis in religious studies, basically an expanded form of it. And it talks about different ascent technologies that people did in ancient times. How did they go to the stars? What was the formula for doing that? How did they manage to do it? What did they experience when they got there? Is this a kind of contact? And can we, exploit these old systems, these old methods? They're shamanistic in some cases. They go back to Jewish mysticism in other cases. They're all over the world. Can we duplicate some of this and understand it? And we had like online discussions about it. But now what we want to do at Joshua Tree, oddly enough, which is Contact in the Desert territory, at Joshua Tree, the end of February, the last week of February, starting February 26th, I think to March 2nd, we're doing this event, and it's called Stairway to Heaven. You can find information about it on my Facebook page, and of course I've tweeted about it as well, or X'd about it, or whatever you call it. So it's there. Marco Visconti has talked about it as well. It's an event. We're trying to do this in person. I mean, not trying. I'm going to be there in person, doing like a 5-day retreat where we're going to get very immersive in this field, very immersive in the subject. It's not going to be only talking about it. We're going to try to do basic things to try to work our way up towards that experience of celestial ascent. That's going to be really the goal of this, is to have that experience, because you can get a lot from books, but you cannot get the experience. And to have the experience, to know what the books are talking about, is very valuable. Even if it's just the opening, the sort of the gateway or portal experience, to have this this feeling and have a place to put the information that you get from the studies, the books, and all the rest of it, to have a place to put it in your own consciousness, to understand how it works and to work with it in a more proactive way. I think that's what we're trying to do. We're going to do our best over 5 days to give everybody this kind of sensation, this feeling of and a deeper understanding of the texts as well, that you really can't do on an online forum. You really need the sort of face-to-face personal thing that I used to do many years ago, and trying to do it this time. So look on my Facebook page. It's called magical-retreats.com, I think, /Stairway to Heaven, or just look on my Facebook page, Peter Levenda Facebook, or my Twitter feed. You'll find information about it there, or on Marco Visconti's as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. That's such a cool idea for an event to give people that experience and to let them really internalize it. Like you said, it's different from just reading about things, right?
Sure.
I wish I could make it, but maybe something will happen and I can come join you guys there. But we'll see. But thank you so much.
Nice. And I also want to plug the other space that you're gonna do with Galactic Troubadour. Also, Rocky's gonna be a part of that space. So for those who are still reading the books, I would recommend that you keep reading and wait until October the 3rd is gonna be, and that's gonna be about the book, which is I'm very excited for.
Yes.
All right, so let's move on to questions from the audience. Let's start with Awesome Rocky, and then we go to Christian.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate you doing this. I love your perspective because you're so well-rounded in so many areas. One of the things that I went down a rabbit hole of this year was cybernetics, and particularly, during the Cold War, we were looking at like the Soviet views of cybernetics, and they kind of talked about, how pieces of science and technology cause man to evolve to them. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, how that relates to like the UFO phenomenon.
Well, cybernetics, I talked about a little bit in the Secret Machines books, because it is a fascinating field. We don't really talk about it that much anymore. It was like really big in the 50s. I think everybody had a copy of the book. There was a book on cybernetics that was very popular. Everybody had it. I had an old copy of it as well. And it was the idea that, you could, this merging of machine and mind, which is so fascinating. And as I said earlier, we're at the verge of becoming our own ETs. We're on the verge of becoming our own non-human intelligence. We're going into space anyway, right? We're going to be the ET for somebody else, eventually. So this idea of the merging of man and machine was brought about early in the 1950s by a couple of scientists who were saying that you're going to have to do this in order to go into space. You're going to have to create a kind of cyborg, which is going to be part machine and part human, just in order to travel the distances that we're talking about, that a frail human being itself to do it. So this idea that maybe if we're trying to do that on our own, is that what's already happened? Is that what the NHI or the ET represents to us? Are they the final result of a cybernetic program that took place somewhere else, that they encountered the same problem? In a way, that's kind of reassuring, because it means that NHI was an organic creature at one point, was maybe a carbon-based life form that had to make the adjustments to machinery in order to visit us. So maybe we have more in common than we realize. Maybe there are some basic things that we could communicate on, some platform we could meet on. So, yeah, the cybernetics thing, of course, the Soviets were involved in it. They were involved in everything. If you really read a lot of the documentation that came out on what the Russians were doing in the 1950s, the 1960s, it's absolutely fascinating stuff. You can always find that book, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. That's a good place to start. But then there's been a lot of reporting since then. And I had a Coast to Coast with George Knapp last Sunday, and George, was one of those who was in Russia early after the fall of the Soviet Union and was talking to generals and talking to the military about their UFO experiences and about some of the other stuff that was going on. There was a lot going on in sort of the MK Ultra, end of it of things in Russia, but also expanded into all of the paranormal stuff as well. A very strong case for that, which is fascinating because, the Soviet Union was a communist state. It was atheist. It was against religion, but they were willing to look at the cybernetic stuff and the paranormal stuff because from their point of view, this was science and not religion. Religion had sort of deformed it in a way, had colored it in a certain way that was not desirable. But as communists and as atheists, they thought there was still something valuable in all of this weird mystical stuff. So they wanted to study that. They wanted to study this idea of a mind-machine interface. And at the same time, China was doing the same thing. And China was, very virulently atheist, right? Very much so. I spent a lot of time, in China in my life. And in the early days, in the 1980s, when I was first going there, they literally did not know what religion was or what a church was or a temple was. They thought these were meeting halls, right? So they were kind of, mystified by all of that. Not, no pun intended. But they did focus, however, on the psychic stuff. That was okay. And the UFO stuff was okay. All of that was okay to think about, to investigate, to have panels discussing it. There was just no religion involved. So that's what I found fascinating about that period and about the idea that maybe our UFO experience is an extension of a cybernetic program that took place elsewhere and that is now confronting us as we are in the process of developing our own cybernetic space program.
Do you mind if I follow up on that?
No, go ahead. Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess some of the connections that I've made, and I think maybe you've probably looked into this stuff too, but and I think you've talked about this in your books, but the ancient Greek stuff, we had automata that were these robot beings, that would serve the gods.
Sure.
And there's stories in the Mahabharata where we're witnessing this high technology and weapons and things like that. So these things have been interacting with us for a long time. It seems like, and then I noticed during and after World War II, all of these things that happened kind of at the same time, some of the things you mentioned, like the psi phenomena, obviously space travel, then cybernetics, stuff like that. And obviously the Nazis, they used IBM, to automate the extermination of Jews pretty much. Right. But then, there's people like, John von Neumann, who's involved in a lot of this stuff. And he's cited as, being present at cross retrievals by Sarbacher. Right. And, also in the Majestic 12 documents, it's claimed that he got the idea for binary code, from the Aztec crash. And, when, I saw your post the other day about it was the podcast the other day, you were talking about how, the internet might be a means for, us to be influenced. And I noticed this for sure by our government, right? But when I bring up cybernetics and the Soviet view and how we evolved to technology and not the other way around, I can't help but notice that our thinking has become more binary in recent years. And, this makes me wonder, when we talk about gifted technology and maybe influenced by NHI, maybe this is a way for them to communicate or to, guide us in a direction that's more useful to them or something there. But I'm just curious if you've pointed out any of these connections or if you've, gone down any of that rabbit hole.
Well, what's interesting is I was studying books on automata recently because I'm working on another book, which is very far away. It's taking up too much my mental space these days. But it's the idea that that the human body itself is basically a machine. That consciousness and the body really are not the same thing, right? So the idea that we have this body as a machinery for attaining different states of consciousness, that the body is actually something we inhabit. So it sort of begins to emphasize this idea of the body as the machine. So if there's a machine-body interface, it's really just an extension of the same thing. We're developing machines out of metal and plastics, perhaps, but that's just because that's all we have at the moment. That's all we understand. But I know there's other materials that are being investigated for possible use as machine bodies. So if we have a kind of metamaterial approach, now we're talking about exactly what you're talking about, this idea that the technology and the body and the humanity is all of one piece. And maybe the binary thing that you're talking about is an interesting concept, as long as it doesn't, basically devolve us into an us versus them category where we start, killing each other, the zeros and the ones, right? We need the zeros and the ones to cooperate to create this new person that everybody seems to be talking about, whether it's Kurzweil and, the convergence that's happening, or whatever people are talking about in New Age, circles and all the rest of it, creating this new kind of consciousness, this new, not just consciousness, but the new being. So the magical aspect of the body, which has been investigated by the people studying Tantra in India, or inner alchemy in China, places like that, and alchemy in the West. In Europe, I wrote a whole book on that, on Thomas Vaughan and alchemy, that the body was itself the alchemical laboratory, and that we're just learning how to use the body as an alchemical laboratory, to be proactive, not to let the DNA dictate to us, what we're doing, but to be proactive and trying to investigate the body and trying to find out what the body can and cannot do, what it's capable of doing already that we think it's not capable of. That's a roundabout way of answering your question, I guess, but that's sort of where I was going with that.
All right.
Hey, so
Christian is next. Yeah.
Yeah. So Peter, I hope you're willing to take a little bit of weird questions, since we know the phenomena stays rational and makes complete sense.
Yeah, this whole conversation's been very normal. So,
so let me see how I word this, because it's kind of hard, honestly. But there's rumors that the secrecy is that on the top of the secrecy is actually the phenomena itself. And I wanna say a few things, and then it's gonna kind of end up as an experience you had in the '90s with two women that were somehow following you to your car. It's kind of like an MIB experience. That's kind of where it's going to end up. But then I want to read. So here's what you said to James Glandoli, while we were we're talking about disclosure. You were saying, we're watching you. We know where you are. We know in advance what you're going to do. If you tell anyone, you and your family might be in danger or something like that. And we can't even tell where these people are. We can't see them, as they're invincible. They don't use lethal warfare, but they use non-lethal warfare. We can't disclose because the phenomena is saying don't disclose, and everybody's freaking out. Sean Kirkpatrick, Rush, Congress, etc. And then this last thing I'll read. It's slide 9. The science exists for an enemy of the United States to manipulate both physical and cognitive environments in order to penetrate U.S. facilities, influence decision makers, and compromise national security. And then it goes into psychotronic weapons. Maybe it's something to do with Havana syndrome. I don't know. Who am I? And other things. And I wonder if there's a connection to that experience that you had. And what do you make of that experience? Why do you think you had that experience in the '90s before you even saw a UFO? And do you think these whole group is something stranger than just the CIA? Or, you know what I mean? I don't know. I know that sounded strange, but that's what I want to ask.
wow. Okay. Okay. Let me see. Where do I start? Okay. Yeah. Let's start with the experience and work backward then. The experience I've told people before, I've written about it actually in Secret Machines also, I think in War. This is something that's stayed with me my entire life because it doesn't make any sense at all. I was living, a nice, quiet, life in a small town in Rhode Island. And it was, I believe, 1990 when this happened, or the end of 1990. Whenever it was around the time that the first Gulf War. It stays in my mind for a reason. And so I'm unloading a car. I had driven to my house. I'm unloading groceries from a car, and I look up and I see this old model black Cadillac in the road right in front of the house. You have to understand, this is a small town in Rhode Island. It's, houses are distant from each other. It's not a busy street. It's a country road, basically. It's paved, but it's a country road. And this car is just idling in front of the house, and there's this camera pointed at me with this wide angle lens. And I'm freaked out. Like, why would somebody be doing that, right? I mean, I wasn't involved in anything that would have caused that. So I put my groceries down and I start walking towards the car. The car takes off. So I go to my car. I'm going to follow the car. I want to know who these people are. And before I can do that, another car shows up, and it's an old fashioned, again, it's a station wagon with the wood panels, the very old sort of 1960-ish kind of station wagon. And it pulls right in behind my car, blocking me, so I can't get out of my driveway. And the door is open and two women get out. And this is the freaky thing. It's like, why would they do that, right? Why would they get out of the car? Because they're asking me directions. And that doesn't make sense. And they open the door and they stand, outside of the car, and they're dressed in like old clothing, old cloth coats, and they look, my feeling of looking at them was like they were Manson girls, like Charles Manson family types, the kind of sweet, very white looking faces, sort of, with this quizzical expression on them. And, the driver asked me if I knew where de Vilbius lived. And I'm agitated because I want to follow the other car. And I say, I have no idea. I mean, the name meant nothing to me as far as, somebody living in Rhode Island. And they said, okay, thank you. And they got back in their car and they drove out. And by that time, it was too late for me to follow the first car. And to show you how quick I am on my feet, I didn't realize that second car was part of that team, right? Or else I would have followed that car. It didn't occur to me until like 2 minutes later. Then I thought, oh, what an idiot I am. I should have followed them. And then I'm thinking, well, why did all that happen? It just was the strangest experience. And I started to think about de Vilbius. Who's de Vilbius? And I realized I knew that name, but it was the name of a company in Ohio. And the reason I knew it is because this guy that I worked with at the time, or just before, had told me about this company and said, you should try to contact that company because they're involved in the same business you are, and maybe you can get sales out of this company. And long story. And that's why de Vilbius was there, a very bizarre name, a very odd name. Devilbis, de Vilbius, one word. So it stuck, and the guy who gave me that lead had worked in Alabama, right, at Huntsville. He had worked at NASA, years and years ago when Wernher von Braun was there. And he had sort of retired and moved up to Rhode Island and was working out of Rhode Island. And he's the guy who gave me that de Vilbius thing. So I started putting that together, and I still couldn't figure out what all of this meant. And then years later, I've moved to Malaysia. I'm living in Kuala Lumpur. And I arrive in Singapore airport at Changi, and I'm going to take a connecting flight. And I'm tired. I must have been flying all day. And I'm dragging my suitcase through the airport. And someone taps me on the shoulder, and which is very unusual. You don't do that in Asia. The human contact like that is not normal. Someone tapping me, it must have been, somebody from another country. Anyway, I get tapped on the shoulder, and I turn around to see who it is, like who would tap me on the shoulder. And it was the girl who had asked me the directions to de Vilbius. And she's looking at me, she smiles, and she waves, right? And I'm staring at her, thinking, what the hell is this? This is on the other side of the world, and it's at least 6-7 years later, if maybe more. So I turn around and I take off after her, and of course I don't find her. She disappears in the crowd somehow. I look up and down, and I don't know where she is, and I'm thinking, what the hell was that all about? And then, years later, I'm with Timothy Good, famous UFO researcher from England. We had been at this conference in Amsterdam this secret space program conference or something. And Timothy Good and I are by ourselves in this hotel, and he has a bottle of scotch, so we have nothing else to do. So we started drinking, and I think it was then that he told me about this this technique that if you want to find out, if you want to make contact because they're among us, he was expressing this belief that the NHIs were here with us. All you had to do was go to a very busy place like an airport, sit down anywhere in the airport, close your eyes, kind of think about it for a little while, and ask them to show themselves. Say, you're here. Again, this is a telepathic connection, right? You're here, you're there, you just want to contact somebody to say hello. And then you open your eyes and you will see somebody, if you're lucky, you will see somebody in the crowd turn around and do exactly what that woman did to me in Singapore. Turn around, kind of wave and smile, and then kind of disappear in a crowd. And so we were talking about all of this, and that's what his recommendation was. And I passed that recommendation on to you because it kind of does work. And every once in a while you can do that, and it doesn't always work, but it does sometimes. And it's interesting when it does. So I forgot what your question was now. I got carried away on this.
I was just saying, because you were talking about to engage in the phenomena, how there's a pressure to disclose.
Yeah.
And then there's basically you said that the phenomena, somebody's calling whoever, let's say some general in the Air Force, I don't know, don't disclose. We're watching you. We know what you're going to do. We know what you're going to do ahead of time. You can't see us. So I wonder if there's any connection to that, since there's so many rumors that the secrecy is really not the government, but the NHI. That's kind of what I want your take on.
Well, it's like this. There's one thing that we know for sure about the phenomenon, and that is it shows up when it wants to. It goes away when it wants to. It knows where we're going to be ahead of time. It knows how we're going to react to things, or it seems to at this point know how we're going to react to things. So it's got all the cards. We have no cards to play in this relationship, right? So it can do things that we can't do. It has technology that is not ours. I don't want to say it's more advanced. We use that expression all the time. It's just not our technology. It's a completely different technology. Look at it that way. And they can do things we can't do. And they can be places we can't be. And if we believe the contactees, they can go into your house and bring you aboard their craft and, experiment on you and then drop you back off. I mean, if all of this is true, then we have no defense against it. So if we disclose, what does that mean? Will it prompt a reaction? And maybe what the governments of the world are concerned about is just this, that by talking about it too much, that by, kind of forcing its hand, it will react in a way that we cannot anticipate. We don't know what it's capable of. We don't know what'll piss it off. We don't know if they get pissed off. So why would we, pull the tail of the tiger in this case if we're not sure how it's going to react? And I think that may be what you're talking about. It may not be something as blatant as don't step out of line or we'll slap you. It might just be our people thinking, well, damn, if they can do all of this, what'll happen if we force the issue? Will they get aggressive? Will we force them into being aggressive? Now, Chris Mellon is saying, shoot the damn thing down. Well, that's pretty damn aggressive, right? And I think he would only say that if he thought that it was human, right? That it was a human technology, that it was forcing a human adversary to react. But that's me talking out of my hat. I really don't know. But this is my reaction to it. Think about these things. Think about the other questions that exist. Can we provoke them into taking action? And will we like it if they do? They may answer our question, yes, we're here, but not in a way we would like, not in a very comfortable way. And that's something else we have to take into consideration.
Thanks,
All
man.
right. I have a couple more questions, but I don't know if Dan has one more before we wrap it up. Dan?
Oh man, I wouldn't even know where to start. There's so much. Just to add, talking about technology and stuff like that, and whether we're being pulled towards this future in which the alien kind of is created by us or something like that. It reminds me of the aerial school landing where the little girl was told by the aliens, don't get too technologized. And I've always thought or wondered whether that played into, you know, kind of evidence that there is more than one thing out there kind of fighting for I guess our souls, for a lack of a better term. I know Peter spoke about, you know, cancer and DNA as kind of being on the two ends of the spectrum earlier, and I'm sure there are religious people out there that would change those terms to God versus the devil. You know, the devil seeds despair while God tries to heal. Yeah, so not a question so much, but just stuff to add, I guess.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, you have with the DNA cancer dichotomy, the binaries, you have, you know, one life form intent on creating and one life form intent on destroying, but both immortal in themselves. But the cancer cell actually destroys its host. And that's fascinating too, from a philosophical point of view. Is that a message? Is that a warning? You know, don't destroy the host, right? Is that trying to tell us something? The DNA is trying to tell us something for sure. The last time I was at the infamous Contact in the Desert, I had done a presentation on the DNA helix, on the double helix, how it had been prefigured in religions going back to, you know, thousands of years ago, how the double helix does not appear in nature except in the DNA molecule. And yet people instinctively kept drawing double helixes. They kept drawing double, serpents entwined around a staff. And this doesn't actually exist, but they saw it. And even in ancient China, from about, I think it's 500 or 600 CE, there was a drawing of the parents of the human race, and it was a male deity sort of and a female deity, but they had serpent tails, and they were twined around each other, right? And so it was like this was how humanity started. And this is a diagram that's very, very old, long before Watson and Crick and the DNA molecule was discovered. So there was this idea that it was always there, that this, we kind of instinctively know it. There's something built into us that is trying to tell us something, and we just have to listen. And, you know, we're afraid to ask some of these questions, but the data is there. As Harry Reid said, you've got all the documents you need. Just ask the right questions.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me, my brain whirs when you talk about things like that, because I wonder, you know, is DNA inside of us controlling us to see something that's out there, to give us a message? Could it be possible? And, you know, we've got to come down to that I don't know again, but maybe we got to get weird with this stuff, right? To find a solution.
Well, we've got to work on it. We've got to ask the questions. We've got to take the steps. We've got to start looking. You know, there's people out there listening to this now who probably have, you know, a key to all of this and don't know it. And they don't have to be scientists, and they don't have to be, you know, have any kind of profession at all. They just may have a key to it. And the idea is to share it. This community is the kind of community that could be very powerful if they all work together.
All right. So Osop and then Andrew before I ask my last question. Is that okay, Peter? All right. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, I actually, I got to go in a few minutes. I have a space with the estate of Ingo Swan in a few minutes. So that'll be fun. Feel free to stop by if you want. But yeah, basically, I'm curious because you did talk about Ingo and obviously the Stargate program in Secret Machines. And also there's a pretty interesting, storyline that goes throughout the Lovecraft Code as well. And I just wanted to hear how you see psychic phenomenon with regards to the UFO phenomenon, and whether like some of these entities are like kind of created egregore psychic entities, or if the psi phenomenon could be a defense against influence from these NHI.
Yeah, a good point to raise, because if we believe the contactees, and I believe them in what they tell me, the NHIs communicate. When they do, it's telepathically. They're basically transmitting pictures into the contactees' brains. It's that kind of a communication, but it seems to be one way. I think that developing our own psi abilities, our own telepathic abilities, would enable us to enter into this kind of communication to the point where we could start transmitting pictures back and maybe kind of develop the rudiments of a communication process. So I think the psi ability from that point of view is important. And the Ingo Swann stuff was fascinating to me for all different reasons. I was working on a book called Sinister Forces back in the day, and I was based in Kuala Lumpur, of all places. And I was working on, that period. I was working on, the SRI stuff and all of that beginning stuff, back in the 1950s and 1960s. And I'm in Malaysia, so I'm not close to resources at all. And I start wandering around town, to a neighborhood that I hadn't gone to before, I'm wool gathering basically. And I see a kind of bookstore that's open air, which a lot of stores are. They have screens they pull down at night, but they're usually just sort of open air. You walk in and a lot of old dusty books on racks. And they're all, covered in a kind of a thick film of dust, and nobody's buying books very much there. And I walk into the store, and immediately what do I see but Ingo Swann's book, Penetration, sitting there, in a bookstore in Kuala Lumpur, just sitting there waiting for me because I was researching it, right? It's the book genie that writers talk about sometimes. When you need something, it just shows up no matter where you happen to be on the planet, right? So here I was in Kuala Lumpur, and in the 1990s, and there's Ingo Swann's book. I'm thinking, how weird is that? I'm researching this guy. I don't have access to Penetration, but there it is. That's all I needed. And I took that book and I took it back, and that, helped me write about Ingo Swann and that, all of that, and his ideas about the UFO phenomenon and seeing UFOs and being in telepathic contact with UFOs. All of this, jump-started all of that thought process. So there's, if we draw boxes too small and too tightly, and we say, well, this is ESP, or this is telekinesis, or this is telepathy, and if it's coming from the NHI or not, we're gonna cut ourselves off from the bigger picture. I think we have to be open to thinking that there's a phenomenon taking place, that we touch it in various ways through consciousness. To go back to that, but it could be telepathy today. It could be something else tomorrow. It could be a vision, a hallucination. It could be a UFO contact. It could be a sighting. All of these things are part of one big experience that we're having, which means that it is connected because we're the connection somehow. We're the thing that's connecting all of this together. And we don't want to overthink it too much. We don't want to underthink it and believe everything that happens. We want to use some discretion and some discernment in the experiences that we're having. But we don't want to just say, well, this belongs over here and this belongs over there, that these things are not connected. No, they are. I don't want to sound too woo and say everything is connected, because when you say that, then nothing's connected, right? But you have to be open to the idea that this may be part of the same experience. This is part of the same phenomenon.
Yeah, maybe you finding that book wasn't weird at all. Maybe we'll find out it wasn't weird, really. Okay, right. Andrew.
Hey, Peter, this has been a great space, man. Appreciate you doing this. My question kind of is about sort of like what people can do in regards to like when they're trying to practice C5 and like intentional contact with the phenomenon. What sort of seems to be lost in any of these protocols, and what I think that they could learn a great deal from the occult people, is protection.
Exactly.
In any sort of summoning ritual or anything, you learn banishing rituals and stuff. And I was wondering if you could talk about anything to be particularly effective before people engage in this sort of a thing to sort of protect themselves from it.
Well, I don't want to be bluntly, plugging my event at the end of February in Joshua Tree, but I am. We're going to be doing that. We're going to be discussing that very thing that you're talking about. But yes, the protection was the one thing that's always avoided by everybody for some reason. And it's especially true when I was researching MK Ultra, for instance. I went through all the documents that were released. I went through the books by people who had been there, done that, and all the rest of it. So I was exhaustively going through, even just the receipts and everything else that they had. And one thing that struck me is that they the MK Ultra was basically a magical experiment. You know, they were trying to figure out what goes on in the human mind and how we can control it and how we can, you know, do these things. And we're going to use whatever resources we have at our disposal. And the one thing that was always missing was the protection. Nobody was being protected. They were taking human beings and putting them through this. Maybe dropping acid, right? Giving them, unbeknownst to them, they were taking huge amounts of drugs or hypnosis or some kind of psychic manipulation. And that person that was undergoing all of this had no protection at all. And that was the problem with these government programs, is that they've taken the protection aspect away from it. And they're just saying, well, this is the human being. This is my laboratory. I'm going to poke around in there and see what I can do. Well, it's wrong for them to do it, but it's also wrong for you to do it to yourself, right? You don't want to just open up the door and see what happens, take huge amounts of drugs and wait for something, spooky to happen. That's not what you do. You have protections. You have to worry about set and setting. You have to worry about people who would be concerned about you and make sure you're not on a bad trip or something. The same thing is true with the CE5 stuff. You have to know what you're up to. You have to know what you're up against. You have to know what you might be opening the door to. Some people will get no reaction at all. Other people, just slightly getting involved in something like this is enough to sort of bend them out of shape, right? So you've developing the strength, the psychic strength to armor yourself against what might happen is very important. And there's different systems. There's thousands of different systems. It depends what you're growing up doing, what your culture is. The Golden Dawn, was famous for teaching everybody the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, for instance, which is a system for developing a kind of protective armor around yourself before you did anything. The grimoires talked about drawing this magic circle, on the ground, with, sacred words in it and all of that. That was a protection device. But it's fascinating that all of these systems that we talk about always start with protection first. Whether it's in ancient China or India or Europe or anywhere on the planet, the protective thing was always first and foremost in everyone's mind. They didn't just jump willy-nilly into a dangerous situation. And CE5 is part of that. CE5 is just a fancy way of making contact with non-human intelligence, which is what everybody's been doing since the dawn of time, which is the whole point of view of secret machines and the cargo cult idea. So yeah, protection is very important. Figure out from your background, your culture, what you do, how to do it, or if you're really that interested, we've got openings at Joshua Tree the end of February where we're going to talk about specifically that and the reasons behind it and the technique of it, let's say. All of that will be part of that.
Nice.
Thanks, man. Appreciate
Okay,
it.
so just to wrap it up, I want to thank Dan Zetterstrom from That UFO Podcast for co-hosting and the Astral too.
No,
Thank you guys.
And thank
And
you.
I want to thank Mr. Peter Levenda. Anything else you want to tell the people about that you got going on?
At this point, no. You've already been kind enough to mention the podcast we have happening on October 3rd. That's going to be fascinating. We're going to try to focus on the Secret Machines War Book as much as we can. There's a lot of interesting material in there. There's people that we talk about there that nobody talks about that are really front and center where all of this is concerned. People like Theodore von Karman or Herman Oberth, or some of the weird stuff that was going on in New York City in schools teaching people about UFOs. There's all kinds of stuff that happened that doesn't get enough attention. So we'll be talking a lot about that October 3rd.
So I guess that based on everything that I've seen going on over the last year, I guess that there's this kind of stigma attached to human potential and what capabilities we actually have or may have. I think that the reductive materialistic paradigm has limited a lot of this stuff, and also the ethnic cleansing that's happened over centuries, that's also been a big part of it. I guess I want to end with asking you, how can people, like in this world that we live in today, how can we approach trying to understand the phenomenon and like coexist with it, despite whatever happens with confirmation or disclosure? What's the best way to approach this? I want to know.
Well, that's interesting, and I think it goes back, in my case personally, it goes back to when I first started studying this, all the way back in the 60s. Um, it was during the time of Vietnam. We had all the assassinations of the president and Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King and on and on and on. We had the Democratic National Convention in '68. We had all these things were going on. And I asked myself a serious question. I was turning 18 that year. And I was asking myself, why, how could I, in all conscience, study spiritual paths at a time of so much political upheaval? Like, shouldn't I be more concerned with the fate of other people, with the fate of the world, with the fate of people being killed in Vietnam, with people being killed in Africa, being killed all over the world, with, military conflicts, political conflicts, ideological conflicts without number. There's so much suffering in the world. Shouldn't I become just a political activist, for instance, and just forget about, going to a monastery or going to a hilltop someplace and meditating? Isn't that socially unacceptable? Isn't that, an unacceptable way to lead your life, to abandon your fellow human beings just on what seems like a selfish path of self-enlightenment? Like, how does that do any good for anyone? And it was a struggle that I had for a very long time, because I would go back and forth over this. Eventually I realized you can chew gum and walk at the same time, that you don't need to abandon a spiritual path and devote yourself entirely to the political one, or vice versa. You can do both. You can show people how both can be done. And also the fact that if more people did adopt a more spiritual path, there would be less conflict. There would be less violence. Part of the problem is us as individuals. We have to be concerned about the plight of our fellow human beings. Absolutely. We have to take steps as much as we can to alleviate suffering. That's very important. But that is also part of a spiritual path. You have to be able somehow to do both. That's why we're here. That's why we're on the planet. For some people, it's much easier to go and become a bodhisattva, and to do all of that and to basically abandon the human race, except that the bodhisattva vow is you have to come back and help everybody else attain nirvana as well. So there is a social conscience in it. It's just hard to see when you're surrounded by so much difficulty and so much suffering, and the suffering of people. As you said, there's been so much genocide. There's been so much slaughter. And so how do you worry about something like the UFO phenomenon when right next door, there's all kinds of horrible things going on? The thing is, you have to do both, because the answer is in both places. When you devote yourself to helping the suffering, you realize they ask you questions you cannot answer, and they will ask you, why is this happening? They will ask you why. Why is there war? Why is there famine? Why is there all of this? You don't have an answer for that. All you can do is fight it, right? The person who follows this path, a spiritual path, begins to realize there may be answers. There may be hope out there. There may be a spiritual solution to this, but it's got to be earthed. It's got to be brought back down from a purely speculative, theoretical place into a place of action. So that's not really much of answering your question, perhaps, but it's what I've had to do in my life, to be a socially aware, politically aware person, and at the same time be involved in something as woo, to most people's way of thinking, as the UFO phenomenon, or mysticism, or religious studies for that matter. Because what's at the heart of the conflicts going on around the world right now but religion? It takes a religious conscience and a religious awareness in order to understand where some of this fighting is coming from, where some of this antagonism is coming from, and to find a way to argue against it. And it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of deliberation, but it can be done. And if more people did it, we would be in a much better place than we are today.
And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to follow a specific religion or be religious per se, just to understand what the role that religion plays in all of this. So, yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
All right. Mr. Levenda, I want to thank you so much for giving us your time. It was a great conversation.
Not at all.
And please be on the lookout for the episode on Psicoactivo. I'm going to edit and publish it as soon as possible. I'm going to ask you to follow everybody you see in here. Those are good follows, so we can all get to know each other a little more and maybe bridge some gaps in the future. Maybe that'd be nice. All right. I want to thank everybody, and I'll see you until the next time, humans. Thank you, Mr. Levenda. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Thank you.